There is a place on this earth where the sky is so large and the land is so flat and the horizon is so far away in every direction that you feel, standing in the middle of it, as though the world has no edges, no walls, no limits, just grass and sky and wind stretching to every compass point without interruption. This place is the Mongolian steppe, and from this place, from this ocean of golden grass at the center of the world's largest continent in the late 12th century of the Common Era, a single man rose from obscurity and poverty and near certain death and built the largest contiguous land empire in the history of the human race. Not over centuries, not through the gradual accumulation of territory that most empires required, in the space of a single lifetime. His name, when he was born, was Temujin. History knows him as Genghis Khan. And the story of what he built, and how he built it, and what it cost the world, and what it gave the world, is one of the most extraordinary stories in the entire record of human civilization. It begins with grass. Before there was an empire, there was the landscape. And the landscape was everything. It was not backdrop. It was not setting. It was the active, determining force that shaped every aspect of the civilization that grew from it. The Mongolian steppe did not simply provide the space in which Mongolian culture developed. It was the reason that culture developed exactly as it did, and no other way. Stand on the open steppe on a clear afternoon and feel what it does to you. The first thing you feel is smallness. Not the smallness of being in a forest where the trees crowd close and cut off the sky. The smallness of being exposed. The sky above the steppe is not the sky you know from cities and towns and even most rural landscapes. It is something different, something vaster. The cloud formations that build over the flat grassland in the afternoon have room to grow to heights that would be cut off by mountains or hills elsewhere. The light that falls on the steppe comes from a sky that extends from horizon to horizon without interruption, and the horizon itself is so far away in every direction that the curve of the earth becomes almost perceptible. The grass moves in the wind with the quality of something alive. In deep summer, it is golden. In early spring, it is the pale green of new growth. In winter, it disappears under snow, and what remains is white and gray and silent in a way that no other landscape quite manages. And through all its seasons, it moves. It is never still. The wind is always present on the steppe, not as an occasional visitor, but as a permanent resident, and the grass responds to it continuously with the wave-like motion that gave the ancient world its description of this landscape as the sea of grass. The Mongolian people have lived in this landscape since before the beginning of recorded history. Their entire civilization is an adaptation to it. The ger, the circular felt tent that is the traditional dwelling of the Mongolian nomad, is one of the most elegantly practical structures ever devised by human ingenuity. It can be assembled by two people in under an hour. It can be disassembled in the same time. Loaded onto the back of a few camels or ox carts, they travel with the family as they follow the seasons across the steppe, moving the herds to summer pasture and winter shelter as the ancient rhythms of the nomadic year require. And inside the ger, the fire burns at the center. The circular walls of white felt are decorated with the geometric patterns in orange and red that have been part of Mongolian material culture for centuries. The smoke rises through the tonneau, the circular opening at the top of the dome, and above the tonneau, the stars are visible at night, the same stars that the Mongolian people have used for navigation and timekeeping since the beginning. And outside the ger, the horses graze. The horse is not simply an animal in Mongolian culture. It is the partner without which the culture would not exist. Mongolian children learn to ride before they learn anything else. The relationship between a Mongolian herder and his horses is the relationship between a person and the thing that makes their life possible. The herd is wealth. The herd is transport. The herd is the military force that will one day terrify half the world. Everything begins with the horses on the golden grass in the amber light of a steppe afternoon. The steppe in the 12th century was not a peaceful place. The Mongolian plateau was home to dozens of tribal groups, each with its own territory, its own leadership, its own complex of alliances and enmities with its neighbors. The Merkits, the Tatars, the Naimans, the Karites, the Mongols themselves, at this point a relatively minor confederation among many. These tribes were in a state of continuous low-level warfare with each other, raiding each other's horse herds, stealing each other's women, killing each other's men. It was a world without central authority and without the concept of permanent peace. The strength of the tribe was the only protection it had. The winters were the test. The steppe in winter is genuinely dangerous. The temperature drops far below freezing, the wind picks up across the flat landscape with nothing to slow it, and drives snow horizontally across the ground with a force that can disorient a rider in minutes. Animals die in large numbers in the worst winters. Families that have not built adequate fodder stores for their herds lose the animals they depend on. And in a world without government or insurance or any safety net beyond the generosity of neighboring tribes, losing the herds could mean dying. The spiritual world of the Mongolian steppe was as real and as immediate as the physical one. The shamans who communed with the spirit world and interceded between the human community and the forces that controlled the weather and the fertility of the animals and the outcome of raids were essential figures in every tribal community. Tengri, the eternal blue heaven, was the supreme deity, present in every patch of blue sky above the steppe, watching the actions of the people below. The sacred mountains were places where the divine and the human were particularly close, where the prayers of a person could be heard more clearly than on the open plain. The mountain Burkhan Haldon in the northeastern steppe was one of these sacred places, and it was in this landscape, near this mountain, in a clan of the Mongol Confederation, that Temujin was born sometime around 1162. His father was Yasuge, a minor clan leader. His birth was auspicious, or so his father decided. The baby was born clutching a clot of blood in his fist, which was interpreted as a sign of future greatness. Yasuge named the boy after a Tatar chief he had recently killed. The greatness was not immediately evident. The world that Temujin was born into was harsh and indifferent to human ambition. The steppe demanded survival before it permitted anything else, and survival was not guaranteed. When Temujin was 9 years old, his father was poisoned by Tatar enemies while returning from arranging his son's betrothal. The clan abandoned the widowed mother and her children to fend for themselves on the steppe. The boy who would one day conquer half the world spent his adolescence as an outcast, surviving on roots and small game, learning the full meaning of vulnerability in a world that respected only strength. He survived. He always survived. And from each survival he drew not only relief, but intelligence about how the world actually worked and what it required to master it. Survival was only the first lesson. The second lesson was alliance. In a world organized around tribal loyalties and personal bonds, a man without a tribe was almost nothing, and a man with the right tribe, the right alliances, the right combination of loyalty given and loyalty received could become something extraordinary. Temujin built his network with the patience and intelligence of someone who had learned from complete vulnerability exactly how the world distributed power. He began by recovering what he had lost. His wife Borte was kidnapped by Merkit raiders, the traditional enemy of his clan, shortly after their marriage. Rather than accepting this as one of the routine humiliations of steppe life, Temujin called in his alliance with the powerful Karaite leader Togrul and launched a full campaign to recover her. He succeeded. In doing so, he demonstrated something to the watching steppe. This man keeps his word, protects what is his, and follows through on what he says he will do. On the open steppe, reputation was currency, and Temujin was beginning to spend it wisely. Men began to follow him, not in large numbers at first, a handful of warriors who had observed what he did and concluded that this was a leader worth following. He fed them. He shared the spoils of raids equally, including sharing with the lowest-ranking members of the group, which was not the standard practice of tribal leaders who typically took the lion's share for themselves. He promoted men based on demonstrated skill and loyalty rather than birth. He protected those who served him with a fierceness that was noticed. The following grew, the alliances expanded, the enemies were dealt with one by one, not always through direct confrontation, but through the patient, strategic combination of military pressure and political maneuvering that was already showing the tactical sophistication that would later define his military campaigns. The rival tribal leaders watched with increasing unease, and eventually they acted. In 1187, a coalition of enemies defeated Temujin, and he disappeared from the historical record for a decade. Where he went and what he did during those years is not fully known. The secret history of the Mongols, the primary source for his early life, is silent on this period. What is known is that he returned, and when he returned, everything was different. The man who came back from the decade of absence was not the young clan leader who had been defeated and driven into obscurity. He was something else, something harder and clearer and more completely formed, as though the decade of absence had been a crucible in which the final version of what he was going to be had been refined from everything that was not necessary. By 1206, the work was done. Every major tribe of the Mongolian plateau had been unified, by force or by negotiation, or some combination of the two. The great Kurultai, the assembly of all Mongol clan leaders, gathered on the banks of the Onon River. The nine-tailed white banner that signified the supreme authority of the Mongolian people was planted in the earth, and Temujin was proclaimed Genghis Khan, the universal ruler, the Khan of Khans. The steppe had been united for the first time in its recorded history, and the man who had united it was already looking beyond it. To understand what Genghis Khan built, you have to understand what made it different from everything that had come before. The Mongol army was not simply a large cavalry force. It was a military system of extraordinary sophistication that combined mobility, firepower, discipline, intelligence gathering, logistics, and psychological warfare into a single integrated machine that no contemporary force could match. The mobility was the foundation. A Mongol warrior typically traveled with 4 or 5 horses, rotating between them, so that he could cover distances in a day that would exhaust any army that depended on a single mount. An army that could not be caught, could not be defended against in the conventional sense. By the time a defending force had organized itself in one location, the Mongol cavalry was already somewhere else. The firepower was the Mongol composite bow, a weapon made from layers of wood and horn and sinew, glued and bound together over months of careful work that had a range significantly greater than the bows of contemporary European and Chinese armies, and could be fired accurately at full gallop. A Mongolian warrior trained from childhood could fire 10 to 12 aimed arrows per minute from a moving horse. Multiply this by the size of a Mongol army, and the mathematical result is a quantity of accurate projectiles being delivered at range that no infantry formation and no armored cavalry could withstand without taking catastrophic casualties. The discipline was what set the Mongol army apart from the tribal raiding parties that had preceded it. Genghis Khan organized his army on the decimal system: units of 10, units of 100, units of 1,000, units of 10,000, the tumen, the basic operational formation of the Mongol army. Each level of command had clear authority and clear responsibility. Orders moved through the system with a clarity and speed that no contemporary army could match, and the penalty for disobedience was death. Not the casual, erratic punishment of a tribal leader, the systematic, certain punishment of a military code that was applied without exception. The intelligence was perhaps the most underappreciated element. Before each campaign, Mongol agents traveled through the target territory as merchants and travelers, gathering information about roads, fortifications, local politics, available supplies, and the disposition of defending forces. By the time the Mongol army appeared on the horizon, its commanders already knew what they were going to find in exhaustive detail. And the psychological warfare was deliberate and calculated. Cities that surrendered without resistance were treated with relative leniency. Cities that resisted were treated with comprehensive ferocity, and that ferocity was publicly known. The choice was presented clearly to every target: yield and survive, resist and be destroyed. Many cities chose survival, and every city that chose survival without a fight was a victory that cost the Mongol army nothing. Genghis Khan had looked at the tools available to him on the steppe and built from them a military instrument that would operate on the world stage with devastating effectiveness. The first great target was China, or rather the first part of China, because China in the early 13th century was not a unified country, but a collection of kingdoms and dynasties occupying different portions of the territory. The northern part, closest to the steppe, was ruled by the Jin Dynasty, a regime of Jurchen origin that had itself invaded northern China from the northeast a century earlier and had established its capital at Zhongdu, the city that would eventually become Beijing. The Jin dynasty had been managing the relationship with the northern nomads for generations through a combination of military superiority, strategic defensive works, and the payment of tribute that kept the most dangerous steppe leaders nominally satisfied. The Great Wall, that extraordinary engineering achievement that snaked along the northern edge of China for thousands of miles, was the physical expression of this management strategy. Keep the nomads out, or if they come through, channel them into areas that can be defended. Against the Mongol army, neither the management strategy nor the wall worked. Genghis Khan approached the problem of China with the same intelligence he had applied to the unification of the steppe. He did not simply throw his cavalry at the walls of Chinese cities. He understood that the Mongol army, unsurpassed in the open field, had a weakness against fortified cities, and he addressed the weakness systematically. He incorporated Chinese engineers into his army, not as slaves performing forced labor, but as valued specialists whose expertise was recognized and rewarded. These engineers brought with them the technology of Chinese siege warfare, the catapults, the trebuchets, the battering rams, the fire weapons, the techniques for undermining walls and building approach ramps, and creating the conditions under which a cavalry army that could not climb walls could nevertheless take a defended city. The Gobi Desert that separated the Mongolian steppe from northern China was crossed at night using the stars for navigation, moving the army across terrain that Chinese strategists had believed made large-scale invasion from the north impossible. The crossing itself was the first demonstration to China that the rules of military geography it had relied on no longer applied. The Jin dynasty fought back. The battles were enormous, and the Jin armies were not negligible. For nearly 2 decades, the campaign ground forward, with the Mongol army gradually dominating the northern Chinese countryside, while the Jin court retreated southward from one fortified city to another. The capital, Zhongdu, fell in 1215. The Jin dynasty continued for another 2 decades, its final defeat coming in 1234, years after Genghis Khan himself had died. The conquest of northern China was not a quick triumph. It was a grinding, sustained, methodical campaign that demonstrated the Mongol military system's ability to operate over enormous distances and extended timeframes with consistent effectiveness. And while the Chinese campaign was proceeding, Genghis Khan turned his attention westward. The world to the west of the Mongol Empire in the early 13th century was dominated by one of the greatest civilizations then existing on Earth. The Islamic world at its height was extraordinary, stretching from the Iberian Peninsula in the west to the borders of India in the east, from Central Asia in the north to the Red Sea in the south. It encompassed the most productive agricultural land in the Middle East and North Africa, the most important trade routes connecting Asia and Europe, and some of the greatest cities the medieval world had produced. Baghdad was the intellectual center of the civilization, the house of wisdom, the great library and translation center founded under the Abbasid Caliphate had been systematically collecting and translating every text of knowledge it could find from every civilization in the known world. Greek philosophy and mathematics, Indian astronomy and numerals, Persian literature and history, Chinese technology, all of it flowing into Baghdad to be absorbed and extended and transmitted back out as the accumulated knowledge of the medieval world's most sophisticated intellectual culture. The Khwarezmian Empire, ruled by Shah Muhammad II, controlled the Central Asian portion of this world. Its territory stretched from the Caspian Sea to the Persian Gulf and eastward into what is now Afghanistan. Its cities were among the most prosperous on the Silk Road. Samarkand and Bukhara and Urgench and Merv were names that meant wealth and culture and learning to the entire medieval world. Genghis Khan had no initial plan to conquer this empire. He sent trade envoys to the Shah, proposing a commercial relationship between the two empires that would benefit both. The Shah killed the envoys. In some versions of events, he also executed the merchants traveling with them and sent back the single surviving envoy with his beard shaved as an insult. The response to the death of his envoys tells you everything about how Genghis Khan understood the world and his place in it. He spent 3 days alone on a mountain in prayer. Then he came down and told his generals to prepare for war. Not defensive war, not punitive war, the total, comprehensive destruction of the Khwarezmian Empire. Every city, every army, every structure of power. The Shah who had insulted the Khan's envoys would lose everything. The army that assembled on the Central Asian plain in 1219 was the most powerful military force the world had yet seen. Perhaps 120,000 cavalry, engineers from China, administrators from conquered territories, a logistic system capable of sustaining a campaign across thousands of miles of desert and mountain. The Western campaign was beginning. The Khwarezmian Empire had 200,000 soldiers. It also had the cities of the Silk Road, whose wealth had funded defensive fortifications of genuine quality over generations. The Shah was not without resources. He was not without capable subordinates. He was not, by any reasonable standard of medieval military power, a weak ruler confronting an obviously superior force. He made one critical mistake. He dispersed his forces to garrison the individual cities rather than concentrating them to meet the Mongol army in the open field. The logic was understandable. The cities were the wealth he needed to protect. The cities were where his population lived and where his tax revenues came from. If he lost the cities, he lost everything, even if he won a battle in the open field. But the dispersal meant that no single garrison had enough force to resist the full weight of the Mongol army, and the Mongol army could concentrate against any single point faster than the Shah could reinforce it from the others. Genghis Khan crossed the Sar-Darya River on a broad front in early 1220. Multiple columns, each one a complete self-sustaining military force operating on parallel axes that made it impossible for the Shah to determine where the main blow would fall. By the time it became clear that everywhere was receiving the main blow simultaneously, the strategic situation had already become irretrievable. Bukhara fell. Genghis Khan rode his horse into the main mosque of the city, which the Muslim historians recorded as a deliberate desecration. He told the gathered citizens that he was the punishment of God, come to visit upon them the penalty for their sins. Whether he believed this about himself or understood it as a useful piece of psychological theater is impossible to know. The effect was the same. Bukhara submitted and was treated relatively leniently by Mongol standards. Those cities that chose resistance were treated in an entirely different way. Samarkand, the grandest city in Central Asia, fell within days. Urgench, which chose to resist, was destroyed so thoroughly that the irrigation canals that had made it the agricultural heart of the region were demolished, and the land around it returned to desert for generations. The Western campaign had destroyed one of the most powerful empires in the Islamic world in the space of 2 years. While Genghis Khan consolidated the conquest of Central Asia, the cavalry force under his 2 greatest generals continued westward. Jebe and Subutai were both commanders of the highest caliber. Jebe had once been Genghis Khan's enemy before being defeated and incorporated into the Mongol military, rising on pure merit to command. Subutai was arguably the greatest purely operational military mind of the medieval world, a man who would eventually plan campaigns that spanned multiple countries and years with a precision that modern military historians find remarkable. Their Western reconnaissance was unprecedented in military history. A cavalry force of perhaps 20 to 30,000 moving through the Caucasus Mountains, defeating Georgian and Armenian armies, crossing the Caucasus into the Russian steppe, engaging and destroying a combined force of Russian princes and Cuman nomads at the Battle of the Sit River. And then, as suddenly as they had appeared, they were gone. They turned eastward and rejoined the main army. The Russian princes who had survived the encounter tried to explain what had happened to them. Riders from the east, moving faster than anything natural, appearing from nowhere, gone as suddenly as they arrived. The chronicles of the period describe the event with the bewildered language of people trying to understand something entirely outside their previous experience. What they had experienced was the Mongol cavalry at operational range. Not the full army, not even a significant fraction of the full army. A reconnaissance force conducting a strategic survey of the lands to the west, collecting intelligence about roads and rivers and cities, and the military capacity of the peoples they would one day return to conquer in full. Genghis Khan received their reports. He filed the information. The West would be attended to in due course. There were other things to do first. The Western campaign had demonstrated the full strategic reach of the Mongol military system. From the Mongolian steppe to the Caspian Sea, from the Gobi Desert to the Caucasus Mountains, the empire was operating simultaneously across a geographic scale that no previous political entity had ever attempted to manage, and it was working. In 1226, Genghis Khan launched one final campaign, against the Tangut Kingdom of Shi Sha in northwestern China, which had refused to provide troops for the Western campaign when required. The refusal was the kind of defiance that the Khan's political world could not accommodate. It was dealt with in the way all such defiance was dealt with. The campaign was successful. Shi Sha was destroyed, but during the campaign, the Khan was injured in a fall from his horse. He was in his mid-60s, ancient by the standards of the steppe. The injury compounded what was already a body that had endured 4 decades of campaigning across some of the most demanding terrain on Earth. He died in August 1227. The exact location and the exact cause are not precisely known. The secret history says he died in his tent during the Shi Sha campaign. It says nothing more specific than that. The funeral procession that carried his body back to Mongolia crossed the steppe at night by torchlight, a river of fire moving through the darkness toward the mountains where the Khan would be buried. The burial site was kept secret. The escort reportedly killed anyone they encountered on the way to prevent knowledge of the route from spreading. Trees were planted over the grave. The location was lost within a generation. It has never been found. He asked to be buried without markers, no pyramid, no mausoleum, no monument except the empire itself. The empire he left behind was the largest ever built by a single person. His sons divided it according to the Mongol tradition of distributing territory among male heirs. The eldest son, Jochi's descendants, received the westernmost territories, eventually becoming the Golden Horde. The second son, Chagatai, received Central Asia. The third son, Ogadai, received the Mongolian heartland and became the Great Khan, the supreme ruler of the entire empire. The youngest son, Tolu, received the traditional Mongolian homeland. The division was supposed to maintain unity under the Great Khan's overall authority. In the short term, it worked. In the long term, it would be the structural fault that eventually destroyed the empire's coherence. But in 1227, that was still in the future. What was present was the empire, stretching from the Pacific coast of China to the western borders of Russia, encompassing perhaps a quarter of the world's total land surface, holding under a single political authority more human beings than any previous empire in history. The horsemen from the steppe had inherited the world. Ogadai Khan, the third son of Genghis Khan and his chosen successor, was a different kind of ruler from his father. Genghis Khan had been a nomad who became a conqueror. He had never been entirely comfortable with the apparatus of settled civilization. He had lived in tents his entire life, conducting his court from horseback and from the felt gur that was assembled wherever the army camped. The administration of the empire had grown up around him, but it had always been subordinate to the military. Ogadai understood that the empire needed something more permanent, a fixed point, a capital, a city from which the administration could operate with the stability and continuity that the empire's complexity now required. He chose a location in the Orkhon River Valley in central Mongolia, a valley that had historical significance as the seat of previous steppe empires going back to the ancient Turkic period. He called the city Karakorum. What grew there was extraordinary, not by the standards of the great settled civilizations the Mongols had conquered. Compared to Beijing or Samarkand or Baghdad, Karakorum was modest in its physical scale. But for what it was, a permanent administrative capital on the open steppe, it was remarkable. A Flemish friar named William of Rubruck visited Karakorum in 1254 and left a description that remains the most detailed European account of the Mongol capital. He describes a city with 12 temples of different religions, 2 mosques, and 1 Nestorian Christian church, with markets selling goods from every corner of the known world. with craftsmen from France and Persia and China working side by side, producing the luxury goods and functional equipment that the imperial court required. He describes a famous silver tree made by a French goldsmith named William of Paris. 4 silver pipes emerging from the base of the tree, each one flowing a different drink: mare's milk, wine, mead, rice wine. When the great Khan wished to drink, an attendant blew a trumpet at the base of the tree, and a silver angel at the top raised a trumpet, and the drinks flowed from the pipes. The silver tree of Karakoram is one of the most remarkable objects of the medieval world, not because it was technically complex, though it was, because of what it represented. At the center of the steppe, in the capital of the world's largest empire, a craftsman from Paris was making a fountain of silver that poured wine for the grandson of Genghis Khan. The world had changed. The steppe had become the center of everything. Kublai Khan dispatched the Western campaign in 1236. The target was the lands west of the Ural Mountains, Russia, Eastern Europe, everything that the reconnaissance of Jebe and Subutai had identified as the next territory for conquest. The commander was Batu Khan, a grandson of Genghis Khan and the ruler of the western portion of the empire. The operational mind behind the campaign was Subutai, now in his 60s, but still the most formidable military planner alive. The first objective was Russia. The Mongol army crossed the Volga in the winter of 1237, using the frozen river as a highway rather than an obstacle. This was characteristic Mongol thinking. What the defending culture experienced as a seasonal barrier, the Mongol army experienced as an advantage. The Russian princes expected the steppe nomads to avoid the deep winter, as steppe raiders had always done before. Instead, the Mongol army performed best in winter, when the frozen rivers allowed the cavalry to move across the landscape at full speed. The Russian principalities fell one by one: Vladimir, Suzdal, Kiev. The great city of Kiev, one of the most important cities in medieval Eastern Europe, was reduced to ashes in 1240. A visitor to the site months later wrote that the fields around the city were covered with human bones and skulls as far as the eye could see. In 1241, the Mongol army entered Central Europe on 2 parallel axes. The northern force moved through Poland. The southern force moved through Hungary. The northern force destroyed a combined force of Polish and German knights at the Battle of Legnica. The southern force destroyed the Hungarian royal army at the Battle of Mohi. Within weeks, the Mongol forces were standing on the shores of the Adriatic Sea in Croatia. Western Europe was in a state of panic that its historical sources record with unmistakable authenticity. Pope Innocent IV was writing urgent letters. German princes were fortifying their cities. The French king was organizing resistance. The entire military apparatus of medieval Europe was mobilizing against something it barely understood. And then the Mongol army stopped. In the spring of 1242, news arrived from Mongolia that Kublai Khan had died. By Mongol law and custom, all senior figures of the empire were required to return for the Kurultai that would elect the new Great Khan. Batu Khan and Subutai turned their army around and marched eastward. Western Europe watched them go in disbelieving relief. It would never know how close it had come. The most significant contribution of the Mongol Empire to the long arc of human history is not the conquests. It is the roads. Not physical roads, though the empire maintained those. The roads of connection, the safe passage across the Eurasian landmass that the Pax Mongolica, the Mongol peace, provided for the first time in history, and possibly for the last time until the modern era. Before the Mongol Empire, traveling from Europe to China was not merely difficult, It was essentially impossible for all but the most determined and most fortunate individuals. The territories between the two civilizations were divided among dozens of hostile kingdoms and tribal groups, each requiring different negotiations and different bribes and offering different levels of danger. The journey was a patchwork of permissions and risks that most people never attempted. Under the Mongol Empire, a single political authority controlled the entire Eurasian corridor from the Pacific to the borders of Western Europe. That authority issued the Paisa, the tablet of authority that identified the bearer as a traveler under the protection of the Great Khan. With the Paisa, the bearer could use the Yam relay system, the network of postal stations spaced roughly 30 miles apart across the entire empire, each one stocked with fresh horses and food and lodging for official travelers. The Yam system was itself one of the great administrative achievements of the medieval world. It allowed a message to travel from one end of the empire to the other in a matter of weeks rather than months. It gave the Great Khan real-time awareness of events across a territory that spanned 8,000 miles. It was the closest thing the medieval world ever had to instant communication. And it made possible the journey of Marco Polo. The young Venetian merchant who set out from Venice in 1271 with his father and uncle was not the first European to make the overland journey to the Mongol court. Franciscan friars had preceded him decades earlier, but he was the first to stay long enough, observe carefully enough, and write in enough detail to give Western Europe its first comprehensive picture of the civilizations to the east. He was received at the court of Kublai Khan, the grandson of Genghis Khan, who ruled China and was the great Khan of the entire empire. He served in the Mongol administration for 17 years, traveling through China and Southeast Asia on the Khan's business, observing everything with the mercantile eye of a Venetian who understood the value of accurate information. His book, written after his return, was received with widespread skepticism by European readers who found its descriptions of Chinese civilization simply unbelievable. Cities of 1 million people, paper money, coal burned as fuel, infrastructure on a scale that dwarfed anything in Europe. He was telling the truth. Every specific claim he made that can be verified by other sources has been verified. The medieval world he described was real. The connection that made his journey possible was real. The Pax Mongolica was real. In 1258, a Mongol army under Hulagu Khan, a grandson of Genghis Khan, appeared before the walls of Baghdad. The city that fell before those walls was not just a city, it was the intellectual capital of the Islamic world, the seat of the Abbasid Caliphate, the spiritual successor to the Prophet's political authority, the institution that legitimized Islamic civilization's claim to divine order. The House of Wisdom, the greatest library in the medieval world outside of China, containing perhaps hundreds of thousands of manuscripts gathered from every civilization in the known world. The Caliph refused to surrender. He reportedly believed that the armies of the Islamic world would come to his relief and that God would protect the city of the Prophet's successors. Neither came. The siege lasted 13 days. The walls were breached. The Mongol army entered Baghdad, and what followed was one of the most significant events in the history of the medieval world. Contemporary Islamic sources describe the Tigris River running dark with the ink of manuscripts thrown into it by Mongol soldiers, demolishing the House of Wisdom. The accounts may be exaggerated. They almost certainly describe something real. The libraries of Baghdad were destroyed. How thoroughly and how completely is something that scholars continue to debate, but the destruction was sufficient to permanently alter the intellectual landscape of the Islamic world. The Caliph al-Mustasim was executed. The precise method varies in different sources, The most often cited account says he was wrapped in felt and trampled by horses, the Mongol method of executing noble enemies that avoided the spilling of royal blood on the ground. The Abbasid Caliphate, which had existed for 5 centuries as the center of Sunni Islamic political and spiritual authority, ended in a few days of February 1258. The Islamic world did not disappear. Within years, an Egyptian sultan in Cairo had revived a nominal Abbasid caliphate for political purposes. Within decades, the Mongol rulers of Persia were converting to Islam. Within a century, the Mongol Khanates in the Islamic world had been thoroughly Islamized, becoming the patrons of the very civilization they had devastated. But the Baghdad of the Golden Age was gone. The particular combination of wealth and stability and intellectual ambition that had produced the House of Wisdom was gone. The 10,000 years of accumulated water management technology that the Tigris-Euphrates Valley had developed was significantly disrupted by the destruction of the irrigation infrastructure. The fall of Baghdad was the moment that the Islamic world recognized as the end of something. The historians of the period who survived it wrote about it in the vocabulary of apocalypse. They were not wrong. The Mongol Empire had limits. Not political limits, not economic ones, physical limits, imposed by geography and climate and the particular ecological requirements of the military system that had built the empire. The Mongol cavalry required grass. The horses that carried the empire required the specific type of open grazing land that the Eurasian steppe provided. When the army moved outside the steppe corridor, into forested terrain or dense agricultural land or the maritime environment, the military system that was so dominant on the open plain began to lose its effectiveness. Egypt stopped the Mongols in 1260. The Battle of Ain Jalut, fought in the Jezreel Valley in what is now Israel, is one of the most significant battles in medieval history. The Mamluk army of Egypt, commanded by the Sultan Baybars, engaged the Mongol force that had been advancing southward through Syria and defeated it. It was the first major defeat of a Mongol army in the field. The advance that had seemed unstoppable was stopped. Japan stopped the Mongols twice. The 2 invasion fleets of 1274 and 1281 were both destroyed by typhoons that the Japanese called the kamikaze, the divine wind. The storms that destroyed the Mongol fleets were natural events, but for the Japanese, who had watched an invasion fleet of perhaps 4,000 ships approach their shores, the arrival of the storms at the critical moment had the quality of divine intervention. Vietnam stopped the Mongols 3 times. The steppe cavalry that could cross the Gobi Desert and the Pamirs and the Caucasus was completely out of its element in the jungles and rice paddies of Southeast Asia. The terrain prevented the cavalry from operating at all. The climate destroyed the horses. The guerrilla tactics of the Vietnamese forces negated every Mongol advantage. 3 separate invasions ended in 3 withdrawals. Kublai Khan, the great Khan of the empire from 1260 to 1294, spent enormous resources on these failed campaigns in Japan and Vietnam and Myanmar and Java. He never conquered any of them. The limits of the Mongol military system were being mapped in blood and treasure across the edges of the empire. But within those limits, the empire functioned. Imperfectly, expensively, with growing internal tensions between the different khanates that the empire's political structure had created. But it functioned. And across its functioning territories, the roads were open and the caravans were moving, and the ideas were traveling with the goods. For 240 years, Russia paid tribute to the Mongols. The political entity that controlled Russia from its capital at Sarai on the Volga River was the Golden Horde, the Khanate that had emerged from the western campaigns of Batu Khan. It was a different kind of Mongol presence than the direct occupation that characterized the empire in China and Persia. The Mongols did not colonize Russia. They taxed it. They demanded military service from it. They required that the Russian princes travel to the Mongol court to receive the yarlik, the patent of authority that legitimized their rule. The Russian princes came. They came because the alternative was a Mongol army appearing at their city walls. They came and they knelt, and they received their patents, and they went home. Some of them were executed at the Mongol court for reasons that Russian sources describe with outrage, and Mongol sources describe with the matter-of-fact language of administrative decisions. Many more returned to rule their principalities under the nominal authority of the Khan. The relationship was complex, and its long-term effects on Russian civilization are still debated by historians. Russian scholars in the nationalist tradition have tended to emphasize the devastation and the humiliation. Other scholars have pointed to the ways in which the Mongol administrative practices, the taxation system, the postal relay system, the concept of centralized autocratic authority were absorbed into Russian governance and can be traced in the political culture of the Tsarist state that eventually emerged. The Mongols brought to Russia the concept that the ruler owed nothing to the ruled except survival. The Khan was absolute. His authority derived from the eternal blue heaven and required no validation from below. The Russian princes who spent generations bowing before the Mongol court absorbed this model of sovereignty, along with the humiliation of performing it. Ivan the Terrible, 2 centuries after the end of the Golden Horde, wielded a concept of autocratic power that owed more to the Mongol model than to the Byzantine model that Russian Orthodoxy preferred to acknowledge. History's inheritance is rarely clean. The unity of the Mongol Empire was always political fiction than military reality. The empire was too large to be governed from a single center with the technology available in the 13th century. Messages took weeks to travel from one end to the other, even using the YAM system at its most efficient. Military forces in one Khanate could not respond quickly to crises in another. The economies of the different regions were too different to be managed by a single set of policies. The cultural environments were too varied to be absorbed into a single Mongolian identity. The civil wars that erupted between the Khanates after the death of Mongol Khan in 1259 were not the cause of the dissolution. They were the symptom of a structural reality that had been present from the beginning. The empire was 4 or 5 distinct entities that shared a common origin and a common nominal authority, and that were already, in practice, separate civilizations. Kublai Khan won the civil war and was recognized as Great Khan, but his authority over the Western Khanates was nominal. The Ilkhanate of Persia, the Chagatai Khanate of Central Asia, and the Golden Horde of Russia were independent in all practical terms. They fought each other. They made foreign alliances with enemies of the other Khanates. They converted to different religions. They adopted different languages and different cultural practices. The Ilkhanate in Persia converted to Islam. Its rulers became Persian rulers. Their Mongolian identity absorbed within a few generations into the Persian culture that had conquered its conquerors as thoroughly as the Mongols had conquered Persia militarily. The buildings they built, the poetry they patronized, the bureaucracy they maintained were Persian, with Mongol rulers at the top rather than Mongol with Persian administrators at the bottom. The Golden Horde converted to Islam as well, but remained more recognizably steppe-oriented, its culture maintaining more of the nomadic Mongolian character than the Ilkhanate did. The Chagatai Khanate fragmented into smaller units that contested the Central Asian territories for centuries, and Kublai Khan's China became the Yuan dynasty, a Chinese imperial dynasty with Mongol rulers, following the patterns of Chinese imperial governance with a thoroughness that suggests the Chinese bureaucratic tradition was simply too powerful and too functional to be replaced by anything the Mongols had brought with them. The largest empire in history was becoming 4 separate civilizations, each one shaped by what it had been before the Mongols arrived as much as by the Mongols themselves. The Silk Road under the Pax Mongolica was the most efficient long-distance trade system in medieval history, and it carried something no one intended to trade. The Black Death, the pandemic that killed perhaps 50 million people in Europe and the Middle East in the 14th century, was a disease of Central Asian origin. The bacterium Yersinia pestis lived in the rodent populations of the Mongolian steppe. It had been there for centuries without becoming a significant threat to human civilization, contained by the geographic and ecological barriers that limited contact between the rodent reservoir and human populations. The Mongol Empire removed those barriers. The trade network that the Mongols had built across Eurasia was unprecedented in its reach and its volume. Caravans that had previously moved through dangerous and divided territories now moved through a single political space with regular stops and consistent protection. The volume of long-distance trade increased dramatically, and with the trade, unknowingly, the fleas that carried the disease. The event that historians identify as the specific origin of the European outbreak was the Mongol siege of Kaffa, the Genoese trading colony on the Crimean coast in 1346. The Mongol besieging force was suffering casualties from plague within its own ranks. The commander reportedly ordered the dead to be loaded into catapults and thrown over the city walls. This was perhaps the first recorded act of biological warfare in history. Deliberate or expedient, it was effective. Genoese merchants fleeing Kaffa carried the plague onto their ships and to the ports of the Mediterranean, spreading it to Italy and France and Spain, and eventually to every corner of Europe and the Middle East. The empire that had connected the world had, in doing so, created the conditions for the worst pandemic in recorded Western history. The road that carried silk and spices and ideas and Marco Polo also carried, invisibly and finally catastrophically, the bacterium that would kill a third of Europe. This is the paradox of the Mongol Empire's greatest achievement. The connectivity that was its most valuable contribution to human history was also the mechanism of its most devastating unintended consequence. Kublai Khan died in 1294. He had ruled China as the Yuan dynasty emperor for 34 years. He had failed to conquer Japan. He had failed to conquer Vietnam. He had failed to conquer Java. He had failed to conquer the Mamluks of Egypt. By any standard other than the extraordinary one set by his grandfather, his reign was one of the most powerful in Chinese history. By the standard of Genghis Khan, he had managed the maintenance of a conquest rather than the expansion of one. The Yuan dynasty that followed him struggled with the fundamental problem of Mongol rule over China. The Mongols were a tiny minority governing an enormous civilization that had been producing administrators and scholars and merchants and farmers for thousands of years before the Mongols arrived, and would do so for thousands of years after they left. The Chinese bureaucratic tradition was too deep and too functional to be replaced. The Mongols had to use it, and in using it, they became dependent on it. The later Yuan emperors were increasingly cut off from the Mongolian steppe culture that had produced the empire. They were Chinese emperors with Mongolian names. The army that had conquered China was long gone. its Mongolian cavalry dispersed across the empire, its military effectiveness compromised by decades of soft living in the settled civilization it had once been so destructive toward. The peasant rebellions that erupted across China in the 1350s and 1360s were not simply popular uprisings against oppressive taxation, though they were that. They were also the expression of a civilization reasserting its own identity after a century of foreign rule. In 1368, the Mongol Yuan dynasty was expelled from China. The last Yuan emperor fled northward through the Great Wall back to the steppe, taking with him what remained of the Mongol court and its accumulated treasure. The Ming dynasty that replaced the Yuan rebuilt the Great Wall on a grander scale than anything previously attempted. They were building it not against the Mongols specifically, but against the memory of what could come from the steppe. The memory was vivid enough to justify an engineering project that consumed decades of labor and enormous resources. The Mongols were back on the steppe. The empire that had ruled China for a century was gone. The steppe returned to the steppe. Not immediately, not completely. The Mongol Confederation maintained a significant military capacity throughout the 14th and 15th centuries. There were periods when Mongol rulers threatened to reconquer China and came close enough to alarm the Ming emperors who had expelled them. The northern steppe was never entirely pacified from the perspective of the settled civilizations to its south. But the empire was gone. The organizational genius that had unified the steppe tribes and directed their energy outward had dissolved with the death of Genghis Khan and the fragmentation of the political structure he had created. What remained were the tribes, smaller, still mobile, still formidable in their own landscape, but no longer the singular force that had remade the world. The inheritance of the empire lived on in its successor states. The most remarkable of these was the Timurid dynasty of Central Asia, founded by Timur, known in European sources as Tamerlane, who claimed descent from Genghis Khan through the female line, and whose military campaigns in the late 13th century temporarily restored something of the Mongol dominance over Central and Western Asia. Timur rebuilt Samarkand as his capital, transforming it into perhaps the most beautiful city in the Islamic world, with the extraordinary tile-work architecture of the mosques and madrasas that his patronage funded. The Timurid Renaissance that flourished in Samarkand and Herat in the early 15th century was one of the great cultural flowerings of the medieval world. And from the Timurid dynasty came Babur, who in 1526 crossed the mountains into India with a small but effective army and founded the Mongol Empire. The Mongol dynasty, a name that is simply the Persian form of Mongol, ruled most of the Indian subcontinent for 3 centuries. Its greatest architectural achievement, built by the Emperor Shah Jahan, who was a direct descendant of Genghis Khan, was the Taj Mahal. The most beautiful building in India was built by the dynasty descended from the horsemen of the Mongolian steppe. Mongolia today is a country of about 3 million people in a territory twice the size of Western Europe. The capital, Ulaanbaatar, sits in the northern part of the country, a modern city visible from a distance across the steppe, with its apartment blocks and its air pollution and its traffic. Around it and extending in every direction across the country, the steppe continues, the same landscape, the same grass, the same enormous sky. Perhaps a third of Mongolian people still live as nomads, or at least part-time nomads, moving their herds between seasonal pastures as their ancestors have done for millennia. The gur is still the primary dwelling of the nomadic population. The horse is still central to Mongolian identity in ways that have no real equivalent in any other contemporary culture. The great statue of Genghis Khan on horseback that stands on the steppe 40 miles from Ulaanbaatar is visible from a great distance. It is made of stainless steel. It is 40 meters high. It stands on a hill of the same name that figures in the legends of the Khan's early life. You can climb to the horse's head and look out across the steppe in every direction. The view from inside the horse's head is the same view the historical Genghis Khan would have seen from horseback. The same grass, the same sky, the same vast silence punctuated by wind. The Mongolian people remember their history with a pride that is straightforward rather than complicated. This was ours. We built this. We sent armies to the shores of the Adriatic and the coast of Vietnam and the gates of Europe and the cities of China. From here, from this grass, from these horses, from the ingenuity and the courage and the extraordinary organizational intelligence of a man who was born in poverty on this plain and died having conquered more of the world than anyone before or since. The pride is not uncomplicated for the rest of the world. The memory of the Mongol conquests carries a weight of destruction that the celebration of military achievement sits uneasily alongside. The cities that were destroyed, the populations that were killed, the civilizations that were permanently altered or ended, these are real, and their costs were real. But so is the achievement, and on the steppe, where the wind moves the grass and the horses graze and the stars burn overhead at night, both things are true simultaneously. Every great military achievement in history has a technological foundation. The Roman legion's combination of the pilum and the short sword and the tortoise formation, the English longbow that transformed the 100 Years' War, the gunpowder weapons that ended the age of castles. The technological foundation of the Mongol military was the composite recurve bow. Understanding this weapon is understanding the Mongol Empire. The composite bow was made from a laminate of different materials, a wooden core, horn on the belly facing the archer, sinew on the back facing the target. These materials were chosen for their specific mechanical properties. The horn resists compression, the sinew resists tension. Together, they store more energy per unit of weight than any single material can achieve, and they release that energy into the arrow with greater efficiency than a bow made from any single material. The result was a bow that a skilled archer could draw with perhaps 80 to 100 pounds of force, and that would drive an arrow through armor at ranges where the target's own weapons could not respond in kind. A Mongol cavalry unit could deliver a sustained barrage of arrows at a force that could break up any formation not specifically designed to withstand it. Combined with the tactical doctrine of the feigned retreat, the composite bow became even more deadly. The Mongol cavalry would engage an enemy at range, drawing their fire, then turn and gallop away. The pursuing force would inevitably become disordered as faster riders pulled ahead of slower ones. At the moment of maximum disorder, the Mongol cavalry would wheel and charge back into the disordered pursuit, now fighting against an enemy that had broken its own formation in the act of chasing them. The feigned retreat required extraordinary discipline. Cavalry that is genuinely fleeing and cavalry that is performing a tactical feigned retreat look identical from the outside. The difference is internal. The difference is that the genuine retreat follows fear, and the feigned retreat follows a plan. Maintaining that discipline under the stress of apparent defeat, with enemies screaming at your back, required training and trust in the commander that very few armies in history have been able to produce. The Mongol army produced it consistently. The popular image of the Mongol Empire in the Western imagination is almost entirely negative. The destroyer, the annihilator, the horsemen of the apocalypse who left nothing standing behind them. This image is not entirely false. The destruction visited on the cities of Central Asia and northern China and Russia was real, and it was enormous in its scale. But it is only half the picture. The Mongol Empire was, in its operation, one of the most religiously tolerant political systems in the medieval world. Genghis Khan himself had a personal belief system rooted in the animist shamanism of the steppe, with a particular reverence for the sky god Tengri and a respect for the sacred power of certain mountains and rivers. He observed no single organized religion, and he imposed no single organized religion on the peoples he conquered. The result was a remarkable pluralism. Nestorian Christians held senior positions in the Mongol court. Buddhist monks were granted tax exemptions and traveled freely throughout the empire. Islamic scholars debated theology with Christian missionaries in Karakoram, while Tibetan lamas conducted ceremonies in the same city. Jewish merchants operated their businesses under the same protection as everyone else. This tolerance was not idealism, it was pragmatism. The empire was too diverse to survive if it tried to impose religious uniformity. The Mongols needed the cooperation of the administrative and scholarly classes of the civilizations they had conquered. Alienating those classes through religious persecution would have made the empire ungovernable. But pragmatic or not, the effect was a degree of pluralism that the medieval world found genuinely surprising. When the Franciscan friar William of Rubruck arrived at Karakoram in 1254, he was astonished to find that the Great Khan held regular debates between representatives of different faiths, not to determine which faith was correct, but out of genuine intellectual curiosity about what each tradition believed. This was the Mongol Empire that the religious polemics of the medieval period found difficult to incorporate. The empire that had destroyed Islamic Baghdad was also the empire whose rulers in Persia converted to Islam within a generation. The empire that had devastated Christian Russia was also the empire that maintained cordial diplomatic relations with the Pope, and whose queens were often Nestorian Christians. The destroyer and the tolerator inhabited the same political entity. The medieval world never quite knew what to make of this. Medieval Europe knew almost nothing about the Mongols when they arrived. What information existed came through second- and third-hand accounts filtered through the languages and assumptions of people who had themselves not witnessed what they were describing. There were rumors of a Prester John, a legendary Christian king somewhere in the east who ruled a great and powerful kingdom. Some Europeans briefly confused the Mongols with this legend, interpreting the first reports of the Eastern Army as evidence that the Christian king of legend was finally sending forces to help the Crusaders in the Holy Land. The reality that arrived in Poland and Hungary in 1241 was rather different from Prester John. The panic in Western Europe during the Mongol campaigns in Poland and Hungary was genuine and well documented. Pope Innocent IV wrote letters to Christian monarchs urging unity against the Mongol threat. The Emperor Frederick II wrote letters to the kings of Europe describing the nature of the enemy in terms that drew on biblical prophecies of the apocalypse. The chronicles of Poland and Hungary describe the invasion with the vocabulary of cosmic catastrophe. And then the Mongols left, and the panic gradually subsided into confusion and then into a cautious diplomatic curiosity. The Pope sent the Franciscan friar Giovanni da Pian del Carpine to the Mongol court in 1245. He was 65 years old and enormously fat, and the journey across the Eurasian steppe almost killed him. He arrived at the Kurultai, where Guyuk was being invested as Great Khan, observed the enormous ceremony, delivered the Pope's letter, received a reply, and returned to Rome. The reply was not what the Pope had hoped for. The Great Khan's letter stated with the directness that characterized Mongol diplomatic communication that the Pope should come to the Mongol court in person and bow before the Khan if he wished for peace. Otherwise, war would continue until God indicated by the Mongols' victories that the entire world was meant to submit to them. The fundamental incomprehension between the two world systems could hardly have been more clearly expressed. Rome offered Christianity, the Mongols offered submission. Neither party could quite understand why the other was not accepting the obvious terms. Through all of this history, through the rise of the empire and the conquests and the campaigns and the diplomatic exchanges and the eventual dissolution, the steppe continued its own life. The seasons turned on the Mongolian plateau with the indifference of something larger than human ambition. Spring brought the first green to the grass and the birth of the foals that would carry the next generation of herders and, in certain centuries, the next generation of warriors. Summer brought the richness of the full growing season, the horses fat on the deep grass, the fermented mare's milk flowing at every family's jur. Autumn brought the urgency of preparation, the movement to winter pastures, the slaughter of animals that could not be kept through the cold months, the laying in of stores. And winter brought the test. The Mongolian steppe in deep winter is genuinely dangerous in ways that few other inhabited places on Earth can match. The temperature can drop to 50 degrees below freezing. The wind that has no obstacles across the flat landscape creates wind chills that can kill an unprepared person in minutes. The Mongolian people have developed over centuries the knowledge and the equipment and the behavioral practices that allow them to survive winters that would kill anyone who approached them without that preparation. The horses are at the center of this survival system, not only as a food source, though they are that in extremity, as animals whose thick winter coats and ability to paw through snow for frozen grass beneath makes them the most sustainable of all domestic animals in this environment. The Mongolian horse, small and sturdy and seemingly indestructible, is one of the most remarkable animals in the world. It has been shaped by the same steppe environment for thousands of years, just as the people who depend on it have been shaped. The eagle hunters of the Altai Mountains represent another relationship between human beings and animals that has persisted across the centuries of the empire and beyond. The eagles trained to hunt foxes and hares and even wolves across the mountain steppe are a living cultural practice that connects directly to the period when the Mongol Empire was new. These continuities are the real legacy of the Mongolian world. Not the monuments, not the ruins of Karakoram, the practices, the knowledge, the relationship between people and land and animals that the steppe requires and rewards. The accounting of the Mongol conquests is difficult for any fair-minded person to contemplate. Merv, which may have been one of the largest cities in the world in the 12th century, was destroyed in 1221 with a thoroughness that left the site uninhabited for decades. The population figures given by Persian sources are surely exaggerated, but the destruction was real. A city of enormous cultural and commercial importance was eliminated. Nishapur was destroyed. Urgench was destroyed. Much of northern China was laid waste in the initial conquest, with agricultural land reverting to steppe in the absence of the farming population. The population of China may have declined by tens of millions in the decades of the Mongol conquest and consolidation. Baghdad, the House of Wisdom, the irrigation systems of the Tigris-Euphrates Valley, the cumulative weight of what was destroyed in the Mongol conquests is staggering. And yet, Samarkand was rebuilt more beautiful than before under Timurid patronage that would not have existed without the Mongol Empire. Tabriz flourished under the Ilkhanate as one of the great commercial cities of the Islamic world. Hangzhou, the southern Sung capital that eventually submitted to Kublai Khan, was preserved rather than destroyed and became one of the great cities of the Yuan dynasty. The Chinese imperial tradition was maintained under Mongol rule with sufficient continuity that the administrative knowledge was not lost. The Mongol rulers of Persia built the Maraga Observatory, the most sophisticated astronomical facility of the medieval world, where the astronomer Nasir al-Din al-Tusi and his colleagues made advances in astronomy that would eventually influence Copernicus. The same Hulagu Khan who had destroyed Baghdad patronized the intellectual tradition that Baghdad had represented. The contradictions within the Mongol legacy are not resolvable. The destruction was real, and the reconstruction was real. The same political entity did both. The same dynasty that burned the House of Wisdom also funded the observatory that advanced Islamic science beyond where Baghdad had taken it. History is rarely clean. The Mongol Empire is perhaps the least clean chapter in the historical record. An empire the size of the Mongol Empire does not function on military power alone. Military power creates the empire. Administration runs it. And the Mongol approach to administration was, like so much of the Mongol approach to governance, pragmatic to the point of genius. They used what was there. Every civilization the Mongols conquered had its own administrative tradition. China had the most sophisticated bureaucracy in the medieval world, developed over 2,000 years of imperial governance. Persia had an equally deep administrative tradition. The Islamic world had developed sophisticated financial and legal systems. Even Russia, less bureaucratically developed than the great Asian civilizations, had its own systems of governance. The Mongols did not replace these systems. They placed Mongol rulers at the top and left the existing administrative machinery in place. Chinese scholars continued to staff the Chinese bureaucracy. Persian officials continued to run the Persian financial system. The Mongol rulers received the revenues and made the major military and political decisions. The day-to-day governance was done by the specialists of the conquered civilization. The census was one of the Mongols' most important administrative tools. In every territory they controlled, the Mongols conducted detailed surveys of the population and its productive capacity. How many people? How many animals? How much agricultural land? What crafts were being practiced? What taxes were previously paid? The information gathered in these surveys was used to calculate the tribute that each region owed to the central authority. The paper currency that Kublai Khan introduced in China was another administrative innovation that astonished contemporary observers. Marco Polo's account of the paper money made from mulberry bark that the Great Khan issued and forced all subjects to accept in trade was received with disbelief in Europe. Metal money was the only kind Europeans could imagine. Paper money, backed by imperial authority, seemed like a fiction. It worked, for a time. The inflationary pressures that eventually destabilized the Yuan dynasty's paper currency were the direct result of the administrative innovation being overextended beyond its sustainable limits. But for the decades it functioned well, it was one of the most sophisticated financial instruments in the medieval world. In the popular imagination of the Mongol Empire, the women are largely invisible. This is historically inaccurate. Mongolian women in the nomadic tradition held a position of considerably greater practical authority than women in the settled civilizations that the Mongols conquered. The ger was the woman's domain. The horses were the men's domain. Both domains were essential to the survival of the family. The senior wives of powerful Mongol leaders exercised political authority that had no real equivalent in contemporary medieval Europe or the Islamic world. When a Khan died before a new leader was chosen, his principal wife became regent. The mother of the future Khan had influence over the selection of that future Khan. The Kurultai that elected a new great Khan could not convene without the presence of the senior women of the imperial family. Sorkaktani Beki the mother of Kublai Khan and his brothers, is perhaps the most remarkable figure in the history of the Mongol Empire after Genghis Khan himself. The widow of Tolui, the youngest son of Genghis Khan, she managed the political education of her sons with extraordinary skill and determination, ensuring that all four of them became khans of major portions of the empire. A Nestorian Christian who patronized Buddhist temples and Islamic scholars simultaneously, she embodied the religious pragmatism that characterized the best Mongol governance. The Persian historian Rashid al-Din, who wrote at the Ilkhanate court and had access to sources unavailable to later historians, called her the most intelligent woman in the world. Given the range of the women he might have known, this was not a casual compliment. The Mongol Empire was built on the military genius of men, but it was sustained and developed in its most productive phases through the political intelligence of women who understood the long game of dynastic survival better than many of the khans they served. The Mongol conquests left marks on the physical landscape that are still visible today. The most dramatic of these is in Central Asia. The Amu Darya and Sir Darya rivers, which flow through the territories of modern Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan toward the Aral Sea, had been the basis of one of the most sophisticated irrigation civilizations in the ancient world. For thousands of years, the peoples of Central Asia had been building canals and diversion systems that drew water from these rivers to irrigate the surrounding desert, creating oases of extraordinary agricultural productivity in a landscape that would otherwise support very little. The Mongol army systematically destroyed these irrigation systems as a military tactic. By destroying the infrastructure that fed the civilian population, they could accelerate the collapse of resistance without necessarily fighting every settlement one by one. The tactic was militarily effective. Its long-term environmental consequences were catastrophic. The land that had been cultivated by irrigation for thousands of years returned to desert when the water stopped flowing. The topsoil that had accumulated under agriculture was removed by wind erosion without vegetation to hold it. The population that had sustained the irrigation systems was killed or dispersed, and with it the institutional knowledge of how to maintain the systems. Some of these areas recovered over the following centuries as new populations arrived and rebuilt the infrastructure. Others did not. The ancient civilizational heartland of Central Asia, the territory between the two rivers, was permanently diminished by the Mongol conquest in ways that a millennium of subsequent history has not fully reversed. At the same time, in some regions, the withdrawal of intensive agriculture under Mongol rule allowed land that had been pushed to its productive limits to recover. Northern China, where the Mongol conquest killed or displaced a significant portion of the farming population, saw some areas of degraded agricultural land return to more sustainable conditions. The environmental consequences of the Mongol conquests, like almost everything else about them, were neither simply destructive nor simply constructive. The land carries the memory in its ecology, in the desert that was once a garden, in the garden that recovered from being a wasteland, in the changed watercourses, in the different vegetation patterns. Ideas travel on the same roads that goods travel on. This is the most important fact about the Silk Road and the most important fact about the Pax Mongolica. The commercial network that the Mongol Empire created and protected was also an intellectual network, and the intellectual exchanges that it enabled changed the course of human history. Islamic scholars who had been translating and extending the Greek mathematical tradition since the 9th century were in contact with Chinese scholars who had independently developed sophisticated mathematics in their own tradition. The transmission of the Hindu-Arabic numeral system, including the concept of zero, from Indian and Islamic mathematics into the European tradition, was facilitated by the Mongol trade network. Chinese technologies that had existed in Asia for centuries reached Europe through the Mongol period. Gunpowder, printing, paper. These technologies had been known in China for centuries before they reached Europe. The Mongol trade network was not the exclusive or even the primary route for their transmission, but it contributed to the acceleration of that transmission in the 13th century. Islamic astronomical knowledge, preserved and extended by the scholars of Baghdad and later of Moraga, eventually influenced European astronomy. The astronomical tables calculated by Nasr al-Din al-Tusi and his colleagues at the Moraga Observatory, working under Ilkhanate patronage, contained insights that later influenced Copernicus. The heliocentric revolution that transformed European astronomy in the 16th century had intellectual debts to the Islamic scientific tradition that the Mongol Empire's patronage had sustained. The concept of paper money traveled with Marco Polo's account from China to Europe, where it would eventually be implemented centuries later as the financial system of European capitalism. These transfers were not instantaneous. They did not happen because the Mongol Empire directed them. They happened because the Mongol Empire created the conditions of connectivity within which information could travel. The roads were open, the caravans were moving, the travelers were observing, and what they observed traveled with them when they returned home. The Mongol Empire formally ended in different places at different times. The Yuan dynasty in China fell in 1368. The Ilkhanate in Persia dissolved in the 1330s as its last rulers died without producing stable successors. The Golden Horde fragmented through the 15th century, its last significant remnants absorbed by the expanding Russian state in the late 15th and early 16th centuries. The Chagatai Khanate persisted in various forms until the 18th century in some regions. The world after the Mongol Empire was a different world, not because the Mongols had improved it, though in some specific places and contexts they had, but because the connections they had created, the routes they had opened, the administrative practices they had spread, and the demographic changes they had caused were now permanent features of the landscape. The legacy in Russia is one of the most discussed and most contested. 2 centuries of Mongol rule left marks on Russian administration, on Russian political culture, on the Russian concept of the state and its relationship to its subjects that historians have argued over for generations. The Russian word for customs, the tax system, the practice of the census, the concept of the sovereign's absolute authority, all have at minimum partial Mongol origins. The legacy in Persia is the Islamic civilization that the Ilkhanate eventually became after converting to Islam, the Timurid Renaissance, the Safavid dynasty that followed, the Persian literary and artistic tradition that the Mongol period disrupted and then, paradoxically, stimulated through the patronage of rulers who valued it. The legacy in China is the Yuan dynasty's administrative innovations, several of which were retained by the Ming dynasty that replaced them. The Grand Canal extension, the integration of Tibet into the Chinese administrative sphere, the postal relay system. The legacy in Europe is indirect but real. The Black Death that the Mongol trade routes helped transmit killed perhaps a third of Europe's population and set in motion the social and economic transformations that eventually produced the Renaissance and the Reformation and the scientific revolution. The world we live in was shaped by the Mongol Empire in ways that are real but difficult to trace. The empire is in the roads and the plague and the paper money and the astronomical tables and the administrative practices and the genetic heritage of perhaps 16 million people living today who carry the Y chromosome of Genghis Khan. On a hillside in the Orkhon River Valley in Mongolia, near the site of the ancient Mongol capital of Karakorum, there is a Buddhist monastery called Erdene-zu. It was built in 1586 using stones taken from the ruins of Karakorum. The white walls of the monastery complex are studded with 108 white stupas, one for each bead on a Buddhist rosary. Inside the walls, the main temples are painted in the colors of Tibetan Buddhism, the tradition that the monastery follows. The transition from Karakorum to Erdene-zu tells the story of what happened to Mongolian civilization after the empire. The descendants of the people who had terrified the world from the steppe converted to Tibetan Buddhism in the 16th century with a thoroughness that transformed every aspect of their culture. The warriors became monks. The violence that had been the empire's most visible characteristic was reoriented into the intense mental discipline of Buddhist practice. The same ferocity that had built the empire was channeled into meditation. The same capacity for disciplined organization that had created the Tumen system was applied to the establishment of monastic institutions. By the 18th century, perhaps a third of all Mongolian men were monks. This is one of the more remarkable transformations in cultural history. The civilization that had produced the greatest military conqueror in human history turned its energy toward one of the most thoroughly pacifist religious traditions in the world. The contradiction between the Buddhist teaching of non-harm and the Mongolian historical memory of extraordinary violence was not resolved. It was simply held. Modern Mongolian Buddhism is a living tradition. The monks in the red robes of the Tibetan tradition perform the same rituals in the same buildings that their predecessors established 4 centuries ago. The meditation practices that they follow were developed in India and Tibet and carried to Mongolia by the same cultural currents that once carried the Mongol armies westward into Europe. The steppe changed the world, and then the steppe was changed by the world. And through all of it, the grass continued to grow, and the horses continued to graze, and the sky continued to be the same enormous sky that it had always been. The Silk Road was never a single road. It was a network, a system of routes that shifted over centuries in response to political conditions and ecological changes and the preferences of the traders who used them. What we call the Silk Road is really a family of routes connecting the civilizations of Asia and Europe, any one of which might be the preferred route in any given decade, depending on which political authority was strong enough to keep it safe. The routes still exist. The geography that made them the optimal connections between East and West has not changed. Mountains and deserts and river crossings and mountain passes are where they have always been. The Pamirs still rise between Central Asia and China. The Tarim Basin is still an ocean of sand. The Fergana Valley is still the most productive agricultural land in Central Asia. Kashgar, at the western edge of the Taklamakan Desert, where traders from east and west have been meeting for 2,000 years, is still a city. The Sunday market that has operated there since before the Mongol Empire still brings together the traders of the region in a weekly commercial gathering that is one of the most ancient recurring events in human history. The Silk Road today is both a UNESCO heritage project and a geopolitical concept. The Chinese Belt and Road Initiative, announced in 2013, explicitly invokes the historical Silk Road as the model for a new network of infrastructure investments connecting China to the markets of Central Asia and Europe. Roads, railways, ports, the same geographic logic, the same understanding that connectivity is power. The Mongol Empire understood this 1,800 years after the Silk Road began and 800 years before the Belt and Road Initiative was conceived. The empire that controlled the road controlled the movement of goods and ideas and people between the civilizations of East and West. This understanding motivated the protection and expansion of the Silk Road under the Pax Mongolica, and it motivates the investment in infrastructure that continues to transform the same geography today. There are perhaps 60 million horses in the world today. About 3 million of them are in Mongolia, a country with 3 million people, one horse for every person. The ratio is different everywhere else in the world. In Mongolia, it reflects the deep structural relationship between the people and the animal that has characterized this civilization since before human memory extends. The Mongolian horse is not a large animal. Standing next to the thoroughbreds of European racing tradition, it looks almost small. It is stocky and sturdy and not particularly fast in a straight line over a short distance, but it can maintain a working pace across the steppe for hours that would exhaust a larger horse. It can survive a steppe winter on forage that no other domestic horse breed could sustain itself on. It is, in the ecology of the Mongolian steppe, as perfectly adapted as any creature in any environment. The traditional gur camp of the Mongolian nomadic family still organizes itself around the horses. The horses are the most valuable property. The horses are the measure of wealth. The ability to manage a large herd, to know each animal individually, to understand the medical and nutritional requirements of horses through the specific conditions of each season, is the core of the practical knowledge that the nomadic tradition transmits from generation to generation. The Nadam festival, held in July each year and celebrated across Mongolia, showcases the three traditional sports that were also the training disciplines of the Mongol warrior: wrestling, archery, and horse racing. Not the short-distance racing of European tradition, but long-distance racing across the open steppe, sometimes covering 40 kilometers or more, ridden by children as young as 5 years old. The children who ride in the Nadam races are performing the same basic activity that the children of the Mongol Empire performed when they began learning the horsemanship that would eventually carry the greatest cavalry force in history across half the world. The tradition is alive, reduced in its military significance to exactly 0, preserved in its cultural significance as the central expression of what it means to be Mongolian. The Mongolian steppe at night, far from any city light, is one of the darkest places left in the inhabited world. The sky above it, on a clear night, is the sky that most of humanity has not seen in generations. Not the gray-blue darkness of urban night, with a few bright stars visible through the light pollution. The actual sky, black and filled from horizon to horizon with stars so numerous that the familiar constellations are difficult to find within the general blaze. The Milky Way, visible as a river of light across the zenith. Satellites moving in their silent arcs between the fixed stars. Mongolian shamans mapped this sky before the invention of writing. The nomadic tradition of the steppe does not separate the sky and the earth the way that settled agricultural traditions tend to do. The sky is not above life. The sky is part of life. Tengri, the eternal blue heaven, is not a metaphor. The sky is not a symbol of the divine. It is where the divine lives, visible overhead every day and every night, its moods and its qualities communicating directly with the people who live under it. The thunderstorm on the steppe is an encounter with divinity. The clear, cold winter sky is an encounter with divinity. The particular blue of a Mongolian summer afternoon is an encounter with divinity. The people who lived for thousands of years under this sky were not alienated from the natural world. They were embedded in it in a way that the settled agricultural traditions, with their crops and their seasons and their walls, were not. This embeddedness is what made the Mongol cavalry so effective on the open landscape. They were not moving across the steppe, they were moving with it, reading its conditions, understanding its weather, using its geography in the way that only people who have lived in it for generations can use a landscape. The stars that the ancient Mongolian navigators used to orient themselves are the same stars that burn over the steppe tonight. The grass that the ancient horses grazed is the same grass moving in the same wind. The silence of the deep steppe night, interrupted only by the wind and the occasional sound of horses shifting their weight in the darkness, is the silence that has held this landscape since before history. The Yasa of Genghis Khan was the legal code that governed the Mongol Empire. No complete text of the Yasa survives. It is known through the references of contemporary and near-contemporary sources, mostly Islamic historians, who recorded specific provisions as they encountered them. The full code, if it ever existed as a single document rather than a collection of pronouncements, has been lost. From the fragments, the Yasa emerges as a code organized around a few fundamental principles: loyalty, discipline, the welfare of the community over the interests of the individual. The punishment of betrayal and cowardice and incompetence was death. The reward of loyalty and skill was promotion regardless of birth. The provision that perhaps most distinguished the Yasa from contemporary legal codes in other cultures was its treatment of status. The Yasa applied to everyone. The great Khan and the lowest slave were subject to its provisions, at least in theory. The noble who betrayed his commander was punished as surely as the common soldier who fled from battle. The equality of obligation was not perfect in practice, but its presence as a stated principle distinguished the Mongol legal tradition from the explicitly hierarchical codes of feudal Europe and the caste-organized traditions of South Asia. The religious tolerance that characterized the Mongol Empire was enshrined in the Yasa. Religious authorities were exempt from taxation. No one was to be harassed for their religious beliefs. The practical reason was the one already discussed. The empire was too diverse to survive religious persecution. But the provision was stated as a principle, not just a pragmatic policy. The concept of the eternal blue heaven as the source of the Khan's authority was the theological foundation of the Yasa. Genghis Khan ruled because Tengri had given him the mandate to rule. The victories of the Mongol army were proof of this mandate. The defeats, when they came, were interpreted as temporary withdrawals of divine favor rather than evidence that the mandate itself was revoked. This theology was not very different from the divine right of kings that organized European political thought at the same period. Every powerful medieval ruler claimed divine sanction. The Mongol version was simply more direct in its formulation. Tengri had chosen this man. The sky witnessed the choice. The empire proved it. In 2003, a team of geneticists published a paper in the American Journal of Human Genetics that described something remarkable. They had identified a Y chromosome lineage that was present in approximately 8% of the male population across a vast region of Asia, from Manchuria to Uzbekistan. The lineage was unusual not only in its geographic spread, but in its age. The most recent common ancestor of all the men carrying this lineage lived approximately 1,000 years ago in the area that is now Mongolia. The inference was inescapable. The man who fathered this lineage had an extraordinary number of descendants across an enormous territory. The most likely candidate, the geneticists concluded, was Genghis Khan. The calculation is not implausible. Genghis Khan had multiple wives and concubines. His sons and grandsons had multiple wives and concubines. The tradition of the Mongol Khan to take wives from every tribe and region that was incorporated into the empire meant that the biological descendants of Genghis Khan were spread across the territories of the empire within a few generations. Approximately 16 million men alive today carry a Y chromosome that descends from Genghis Khan or his close male relatives. 16 million. No other human being in recorded history has anything close to this biological legacy. It is the most direct possible measure of the demographic impact of the Mongol Empire. Not the deaths, not the cities destroyed, the lives generated. The genetic consequence of a man whose descendants spread across the largest empire in history and who had children with women from every corner of that empire for generations. The steppe horseman who was born in poverty and died having conquered half the world is present in the human species in a way that no other historical figure approaches, not in myth or legend or cultural inheritance, but in the actual molecular biology of 16 million living people. History is more embodied than we usually think. The relationship between the Mongolian people and their landscape is not primarily aesthetic, it is spiritual. Every significant feature of the Mongolian landscape has a spiritual identity. The mountains are not just mountains, they are the dwellings of powerful spirits that can protect or harm the people who live near them. The rivers are not just water sources, they are living entities with their own authority. The sky is not just weather, it is the direct expression of the supreme divine. The ovo, the cairn of stones that appears on hilltops and mountain passes throughout Mongolia, is the physical expression of this relationship. Travelers stop at the ovo and walk around it clockwise 3 times, adding a stone to the pile, offering the spirits of the place their respect. The practice is ancient. It predates Buddhism. It predates the Mongol Empire. It is the most basic form of the negotiation between human beings and the landscape they inhabit. Genghis Khan retreated to the sacred mountain Burkhan Haldon at several critical moments in his life. The accounts say he climbed the mountain barefoot, his belt around his neck in a gesture of submission, and prayed for 3 days. Whatever we make of the specific religious content of these retreats, the pattern they represent is clear. The greatest conqueror in history regularly withdrew from the human world to spend time alone with the landscape and whatever it contained that was larger than human ambition. The shaman's drum that has been used in Mongolian ritual since before recorded history produces the same trance states in the same ceremonies that it has produced for thousands of years. The spirits that the shaman communicates with, the spirits of ancestors and animals and landscape features, are the same spirits that were consulted before the campaigns of Genghis Khan, before the Kurultai that united the steppe, before the beginning of everything. The spiritual tradition of the Mongolian steppe is not separate from its political and military history. It is woven through it. The sky god Tengri, who gave Genghis Khan his mandate, is the same sky that burns blue above the steppe every clear day. The sacred mountain where the Khan prayed is still sacred. The ovo on the hilltop is still visited. The scale of the Mongol Empire defeats ordinary imagination. Consider the geography. The empire, at its greatest extent, stretched from the Pacific coast of China in the east to the border of Poland in the west, from Siberia in the north to the Persian Gulf in the south. In modern terms, this encompasses the entire territories of China, Mongolia, Russia west of the Ural Mountains, Central Asia, Persia, Iraq, Korea, and significant portions of a dozen other modern countries. A single political authority, traceable to a single man born on a specific piece of the Mongolian steppe in the mid-12th century, controlled this entire territory within the space of a few decades. The population under Mongol rule at the empire's height was perhaps 100 million people, in a world whose total population was perhaps 300 million. 1 in 3 human beings alive in the middle of the 13th century was subject to the authority of Genghis Khan or his immediate successors. The military force that achieved this was not enormous by later historical standards, perhaps 100,000 to 150,000 cavalry at the peak of the conquests. The armies of later periods, the Napoleonic armies of the 19th century and the mass armies of the 20th century, were numbered in the millions. What the Mongol army lacked in numbers, it compensated for in mobility, coordination, intelligence, and the specific tactical combinations that made it so much more effective per soldier than any contemporary force. The road network of the empire, using the YAM relay system, allowed a message to travel from the Pacific coast to the western edge of the empire in weeks. This was the fastest long-distance communication system that existed anywhere in the world before the telegraph. The administrative awareness that it gave the Great Khan over his territories was unprecedented. And yet, the empire dissolved in a single generation after Kublai Khan's death. The same connectivity that made it extraordinary also transmitted the diseases that weakened it. The same diversity that made it rich also made it ungovernable as a single unit. The same military genius that had built it died with the generation that had developed it. 800 years have passed since Genghis Khan died in his tent during the Shah campaign. 800 years. The largest land empire in history rose and fell. The civilizations it disrupted, recovered, and transformed. The specific configuration of political power that it created and then dissolved left its marks on every subsequent century of Eurasian history. And the steppe is still there, the same landscape, the same grass moving in the same wind, the same enormous sky with the same clouds building over the flat plain in the afternoon, the same stars at night, the same freezing winters and lush summers, and the dramatic seasons in between. The people who live on the steppe today are the descendants of the people who built the empire. They carried the same genetic material, organized somewhat differently by the centuries of mixture and migration. They speak a language descended from the language in which Genghis Khan gave his orders and received his intelligence. They practice a version of the same animal husbandry that provided the horses that carried the armies. The modern Mongolia is a democracy. It has a constitution and elected parliament and a president and a market economy integrated into the global trade system. It has universities and hospitals and mobile phone networks and internet connections. It is, in most measurable respects, a normal 21st century country. And it is also a country where a third of the population still lives a version of the nomadic life that produced the greatest empire in history, where the annual horse race at Nadam is watched by the entire country with the passionate engagement that reflects the deep cultural significance of the horse to Mongolian identity, where the statue of Genghis Khan on the steppe is not a historical curiosity, but the image of the founding ancestor, the man from whom everything that is distinctively Mongolian flows. The steppe does not need the empire to be itself. It was itself for thousands of years before the empire, and it has been itself for 800 years since. The empire was the moment when the steppe reached out and touched the rest of the world with an impact that no previous or subsequent contact between the nomadic and settled worlds has matched. But the reaching out is not what the steppe is. The steppe is the grass and the horses and the wind and the sky. The empire was what happened once when a particular man of particular genius organized the particular resources of the steppe and directed them outward with a particular combination of military and political and organizational intelligence that the world has not seen before or since. There is a night on the Mongolian steppe that changes the person who experiences it. Not everyone has this experience. It requires the right conditions. You must be far enough from any settlement that the darkness is complete. The sky must be clear, which on the steppe means extraordinarily clear. The high altitude and low humidity producing a transparency that turns the night sky into something almost impossibly brilliant. There must be no moon, and you must be willing to simply stop and look up and let what is there be there without trying to organize it into something you already know. When those conditions are met, the sky above the Mongolian steppe at night is one of the most overwhelming natural experiences available to a human being. The stars are not just stars. They are so numerous and so bright that they seem to have depth, as though the sky is not a flat surface with dots on it, but a three-dimensional space that you are looking into rather than at. The Milky Way is not a faint suggestion on the horizon, but a blazing river of light that divides the sky from horizon to horizon with a brightness that casts shadows on the ground below. Under this sky, the ancient practices make sense in a way they cannot in the attenuated light of cities. The shaman who believed that the sky was a living presence was not confused. He was accurately reporting what he could see. The Khan who climbed the sacred mountain to pray to Tengri was not performing ritual. He was responding to something that was visibly, overwhelmingly present. And somewhere under this sky, in a place no one has found in 800 years, the greatest conqueror in human history lies in the earth without a marker, as he asked. The trees he requested were planted over his grave. They grew. They died. New trees grew in their place. The landscape moved on. The grass grew over whatever it covered, and the wind moved the grass, and the stars turned overhead, and the seasons came and went, and came again. Tonight, let the steppe hold you. Let the grass be real, and the wind be real, and the horses and the darkness be real. Let the vast sky above be what it is. Let the stars be as numerous as they actually are when the electric light does not reduce them to a handful of the brightest. Let the empire form on this plain. Let the Kurultai gather on the banks of the Onon. Let the nine-tailed white standard be planted in the earth. Let the cavalry form its tumens and move in the fluid formations that no defending army could predict or counter. Let the cities of the Silk Road glow in the distance. Let the roads connect them. Let the caravans move between them. Let the knowledge travel with the goods. Let the empire be at its height. One political authority from the Pacific to Poland. 100 million people under a single law. The roads open. The messages traveling, the world connected as it had never been connected before and would not be connected again until the modern era. And then, let it pass. Let the civil wars begin. Let the Khanates go their separate ways. Let the Yuan dynasty dissolve northward through the Great Wall. Let the Golden Horde fragment on the Russian steppe. Let the Ilkhanate become Persian. Let Karakorum be dismantled. Let the steppe return to the steppe. And then let the grass be what it always was, golden in the sunset, silver in the moonlight, moving in the wind that has been moving across this plain since before the first human being set foot on it. The empire came from the grass. The empire returned to the grass. The grass remains. This is the story of the Mongol Empire. Not the conquest, not the cities burned or the cities preserved, not the Silk Road or the plague or the genetic legacy or the administrative innovations. the grass that gave the world its greatest conqueror and received him back when his work was done. The same grass that grows on the same steppe under the same sky. Tonight, right now, moving in the dark. Sleep well. The steppe endures.